Yes, I can press that blue button, which means that YouTube, in theory, has the sound of my voice landing onto the airwaves. Good evening, everyone. A pleasure to have you along. It's episode 211 of Rail Natter, Britain's SUV problem. We have in the green room, the virtual green room, that is, we have the pleasure of Ralph Palmer from Transport and Environment, waiting patiently in the wings for my haphazard introduction. Before we speak to Ralph, we must jump to, firstly, the COVID stats, actually. It's funny, people don't mention the word COVID much anymore, even though actually we're kind of just off the back of yet another fairly sizable surge. Ralph, this is a thing we do reasonably frequently, although much less frequently now than we did when the data was being updated weekly. We have got... Basically, we've got the usage compared to the pre-COVID baseline of various modes of transport, and I've thinned this down. I used to have bicycles and all sorts. I've thinned it down to private cars and taxis, buses outside of London, and national rail services. I keep the bus one on because it's useful to... Buses captures a greater slice of society, particularly generally those on lower income groups. So it's interesting to compare. Anyway, the bottom is national rail services, and we're bouncing around. So this is a rolling average, so the number is lower than the peaks. We've actually been bouncing around at the 100%, 97% mark for quite a while now. In fact, this whole period basically is kind of, we've been bouncing around the 100% mark, but with days that are lower, hence the lower rolling average. This drop here shouldn't alarm anyone. This is just Easter. That's the data just tails off immediately after the bank holiday weekend, and there's kind of we've seen this parity. There's a strange moment where buses drop down quite low. We've just seen this parity now where rail and there's this. So there was a disconnect between cars and rail and road, but they seem for quite a while now to have been completely pinned together, which is quite interesting. I'm not quite sure statistically what that might mean. Thoughts on a postcard, everyone. But anyway, just want to keep everyone posted. I am going to... We are here, anyway, not to talk about that much more, although we are going to have... everyone, it's a treat tonight. So many graphs. I'm so excited to be digging into them. We're here to talk about SUVs. Like this fine vehicle. I'm going to audio describe what just appeared on screen. This is a Talbot Matra. Oh golly, what's the name of the thing? Oh, I've forgotten the actual name of the mark. Anyway, it's a Talbot Matra. This is the Rancho version of this SUV. It's absolutely glorious. And this is an SUV, except that it's ancient and actually useful. The utility it's back when utility actually meant something as part of SUV. Anyway, it's still not. We still don't want. Obviously these are. This is a small SUV from history. They look a bit bigger than that. It is a car natter tonight, everyone. You're right, Mondo Man 712. Anyway, enough of my waffling. We're going to talk about SUVs. Ralph is waiting for me to actually say something useful. Let's start the show. Everyone, welcome to tonight's Rail Natter. And as the Intercity 225 fades away, there it goes, I have the delight and pleasure. Well, first of all, actually, we're going to very briefly do a little bit of news. The first bit of news is that no HS2 land has been sold to date, despite this essentially being an attempted trap for Labour, despite them sort of seemingly taking the bait anyway by just saying that they're not willing to progress with HS2. The Conservatives have yet to successfully sell off any land from HS2. So contrary to all the reports saying that it's impossible to bring HS2 back, it isn't. They can just basically press on as if nothing happened and there's just been a delay in the project, which isn't quite true because a lot of people have been sacked, several thousand in fact. But by and large, they can just reinstate the project as it was. So that's an important thing to talk about. The second thing to talk about is a new culinary policy on cross-country trains. Peter, are you in the chat, possibly? Yeah, this one's quite a good one, Ralph. I don't know if you spotted this one. I try and avoid doing Twitter review, but the news often ends up being that way because I enjoyed this too much, which is that cross-country trains informed just an innocent person asking for some support here. Okay, thank you. It's okay. Would the seats you book be okay for young children, as they will be 5, 2 and 3? To which Cross Country Trains, the official Cross Country Trains Twitter account, replied, you can eat the children in any of the seats you've reserved as you so choose. Well, thank you, SR, for that. I'm sure that tweet has been printed in A3 and posted behind your seat in the cross-country office. It's always good fun when this sort of chaos happens. Anyway, so the new rail policy that we're eating children on trains now, that's acceptable. Anyway, right, enough of this nonsense. You've waited very patiently, Ralph. Hello. Sorry for the delay there. Everyone, Ralph Palmer is here from... in fact, Ralph, there's no point in me introducing us. Introduce yourself, tell everyone who you are, and then we'll start talking about SUVs. And there's a lot of people very excited about graphs, so we'll get stuck in. Ralph.
Yeah, plenty of graphs to get stuck into. Hi, everyone. I lead on... transport environment's electric vehicle work in the UK. For those that don't know transport environment, we're a European NGO, the sort of leading clean transport NGO, sort of working across many modes of transport. A lot of it's on road transport, which we've been working on for a number of years. But we also do a lot of work on aviation and shipping, and we're doing a lot more work around kind of related energy issues, sustainable finance. And we also have a couple of people working on rail now, which is great. And we've Tini's sort of known, certainly in the kind of Brussels bubble, of being the kind of sort of very kind of in-depth data analysis and evidence-based policymaking, and being a bit noisy at times. And we've kind of turned our attention a little bit to other issues that we hadn't necessarily touched on before, and one of those is SUVs. So we've certainly been doing a fair bit of work on that in the UK office, which is what I'm excited to talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. So we shall crack on. So we start with the thing that I like to do, that I know quite a few other people like to do. We've done it on this episode. In fact, I think we did it on this episode in Jersey, which was, in fact, I know that our guest for that episode is indeed in the chat right now. Yeah, this is George Street in Edinburgh, and it's a fun thing to do. You go into Street Map, Street View rather, and you click the historic imagery and compare what the vehicles look like. So this image is from 2010. This one here, this is 2010. And this one is the recent image, 2023, so last year. And I'm noticing a difference here. So we have a Porsche Cayenne. In the 2023 image, we have a Porsche Cayenne, admittedly, kind of an old Golf, fine. Then we have what is that, Audi, the Q7 or whatever horrible thing. Then we have what possibly is actually just an estate Mercedes, although they're kind of hybridizing their estates. Then behind that's a Audi, anyway, fine, some SUVs in the distance. In the 2010 picture, we have, what's that, a Renault Scenic, a 106, a Civic, a Focus, a revamped Beetle, and a blast from the past, an old Scooby as well in the background there. So quite the difference in size of vehicle. Obviously, this is not a scientific comparison, folks, but you can surf around the UK and just find yourself stuck in traffic on Street View and flick back to the old images. And this just repeats itself over and over again, is that cars are very obviously a lot smaller a decade ago. And you're going to show us over the next sort of few slides, shall we say, that the picture has got really bad, even worse, really recently, which is kind of depressing. So I'm going to stop waffling and showing images and start with the graphics, because people are keen to see graphs, and I would be denying them if I didn't put one up. So the first graph is UK's SUV sales by segment in the last between 2021 and 2023. Ralph, tell us what we're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, I did just on that previous one, previous sort of image. I think it's quite interesting, because I think actually a lot of people have noticed, like just in front of their eyes, just how much has changed in such a short period of time. Yeah. I was speaking to my uncle recently, and he was just talking about, when he was sort of, even sort of 20, 30 years ago, sort of like, the cars were just so much smaller. Yeah. It was just not even a consideration you'd have one of these enormous tanks. But anyway, what this shows, so we did some analysis of new car sales in the UK for the last sort of 3 years, and yeah, I mean, what it shows is that we've staggeringly passed not just the 1 million mark, but the 1.1 million mark of new SUVs coming onto the road last year, which is up by a quarter from 2022 and a third from 2021. So we're seeing, just in the space of these 3 years, quite enormous jumps of total sales. And as you'll see, this is across all car segments. And so maybe just for the benefit of people listening maybe don't necessarily know what we mean by car segments. So a kind of an SUV mini, or kind of an A segment car, is a kind of like a city car, like a really small city car. And so the example there is a Toyota Aygo, which, when you look at what they looked like when they came onto the market, or when they were kind of quite popular, maybe like 10 years ago, they were tiny little cars.
Yeah.
But when you look at the model, the Toyota Aygo model that's come onto the market, I think maybe last year, or maybe it's even, I think it was last year, they've really kind of like beefed it up.
They've thingified it. They've flied it. It's just this huge, weirdly shaped thing that they've bloated out in all sorts of ways. I mean, most modern cars are hideously over-designed anyway. I just think they all look awful because I'm an old man now. But it's particularly these, and this might come up. This has already come up in some of the chat actually. Is this idea that people are saying, well, no, the SUV thing isn't. It's just that they're selling more small SUVs. Actually, what's interesting in this data is that isn't borne out. Actually, it is the larger vehicles that are selling more. But or kind of the medium-sized ones, which we'll get to in a sec, as you say. But yeah, the Aygo started off as the tiny little thing that was like, like the one, what is it? The tiny Peugeot thing. It's the vehicle that was made by multiple different manufacturers. It was tiny. It was smart car sized almost, and now it's bloated. Anyway, sorry. So that's the A group.
Yeah. So so you go through the segments, and I mean, in a very simplistic way, the higher up the segments you go, basically the bigger the car gets. I mean, that's a very oversimplified way of looking at it. And obviously, I think just a big disclaimer here is that the kind of definition of SUVs here is based on this is all based on the kind of the EU's segmentation of car sales. We always kind of get the response, certainly from the car industry, that there's no way to define SUVs. There's sort of no, there's no way to kind of give a clear definition. Yeah. But this is just the EU kind of classification of it. But I mean, again, even in the small SUV segment, so the sort of SUV small B, the Ford Puma, I'm pretty sure, was basically the replacement for the Fiesta on Ford's lineup. When you think about the Fiesta, that was a brilliant little small car that was iconic and is still iconic on British roads. It's still I think it is still the highest selling car in the UK on the second-hand market.
It's the size of a Focus. I mean, even the Fiesta, the last time the Fiesta existed, it's the size of a Focus now. And so,
but yeah, so, as I say, you go through the segments, but even when you look at the kind of compact segment, the sort of SUVCs, which is the kind of highest selling segment, within that segment is a Range Rover Evoque, which is a massive car.
Massive, yeah.
So, and then, medium size, you've got Land Rover Defender, medium large, you've got Range Rover Sport, and then all the way up to kind of the SUV sort of large F, which actually doesn't represent that many sales. But these are enormous and enormously polluting cars. So
it's from this. Basically, from the SUV compact C upwards are what we would, if you saw a car on the street, you point at it and go, that's an SUV. Under that, the vehicles can be a bit, they might look a bit smaller, but really, like in terms of visually, a car that is too big, and it doesn't really ought to be replaced. It just shouldn't be the size it is. It's the compact C upwards, and the numbers speak for themselves on screen. That's a gain of 380,000 in 2021 to 500,000 in 2023. So it's a sizable leap in sales.
Yeah, it's enormous. I mean, it really is. And I mean, the next, I think it's the next slide where you look at it from the kind of, this is sort of what it looks like in terms of the share of overall sales. So, I mean, again, overall car sales went up last year. So I think it went up from around 1.1 between 1.5 and 1.6 million in 2022, and it went up to about 1.88 in 2023. So overall sales did increase, but that doesn't explain that doesn't tell the full story as to why overall SUV sales went up, because SUVs now make up 60% of all new car sales in the UK.
60%,
up from 50 in 2021. So we've, again, keep saying staggering. It is a staggering increase, and we've seen it's an enormous share of vehicles. Comparing this to the EU, so the EU's average is at around 54%. From last year. Now that is still very high. 50% is very high, but it goes to show that the UK is clearly seen by car makers as quite an appealing market to sell these cars into.
Yep.
And there are a number of reasons for that. But yeah, this is sort of it does show just how much SUVs are dominating the kind of new car market. And I guess just to sort of specify, this is new car sales, so it doesn't include secondhand. But of the new cars coming into the market, it is we're seeing an enormous increase, an enormous amount of these new cars coming into the road are now SUVs.
And I'm sure we'll touch,
including those cars, as you say, that are kind of compact SUVs and above.
Yes.
So not just your mini and small SUVs.
Yeah, not just the things that they've called SUV for branding reasons, but we are talking about the big ugly cars that ought not to be on the road because they're just far too large. I'm sure we'll talk a bit more in detail later on about why this is happening, and perhaps we'll talk about some of the consequences as well. But it's interesting. I mean, if we jump, in fact, we can jump to the next slide and continue kind of discussing it's one of the stats I have in my head, and this slide's maybe the time to discuss it, is the fact that the benefits overall to the UK private car fleet of having an increased number of electric vehicles out there has been completely undermined by the increase in consumption as a result of SUVs. Is that stat that to your mind is borne out by the data? Is that correct?
Yeah. So I mean, the kind of I think where that comes from is the Climate Change Committee's progress reports to Parliament. So the Climate Change Committee being the government's independent advisors on climate change that basically analysed where the UK is at in every year across multitudes of metrics on how we're basically performing towards meeting our carbon budget targets.
Climate Change Act 2008. It's auditing in the UK against its. It was created and audits the government against Climate Change Act 2008. Yeah.
And they, in their last progress report, said that the trend towards large cars is offsetting. I think the specific wording was offsetting the CO2 savings that we would be getting from increased engine efficiency.
Okay.
So I don't know if they necessarily said from EV sales, but I mean, to be honest, overall transport emissions, including from road transport, are stubbornly high. They haven't really gone anywhere. So
it's a point I make out in lectures.
It would suggest that is the case, but they pointed to this. They pointed to it that the fact that we're seeing increasingly increasing sales of SUVs is a problem from a climate perspective, and that something does need to be done about it, and they kind of flag it on their sort of list of indicators as sort of something that's going in the wrong direction. And I think there's a slide in a few slides time that kind of shows that. But it is a real problem, and I guess sort of to what you were alluding to with that, the vast majority of SUVs that were sold last year and have been sold in recent years are ones with an internal combustion engine in.
Yep.
Obviously you can see there that hybrids have overtaken petrol. And when I say hybrids, I'm talking the ones that you don't plug in. So I'm trying to figure out like a Prius, but a big one. But we're talking. These aren't good cars from a climate perspective.
I was going to say non-plug-in hybrids are. I was reading a few pieces recently saying that they are carrying a lot more equipment around, more weight, less efficiency, more materials for what is a basically trivial, if not negative, kind of carbon impact. Like they're actually potentially worse than just having a petrol. whether worse or not, but certainly they provide limited benefit over just a standard internal combustion engine vehicle.
Very, very limited. And to be honest, similar can be said about plug-in hybrids, because people who the real world data for plug-in hybrids shows that a lot of people don't actually plug them in to charge and use the batteries. So the real world emissions of plug-in hybrids are also very, very bad. But yeah, I mean, as I say, I think it kind of shows, as I say, the vast majority of SUVs that are being sold obviously kind of reflects what's going on in the wider car market, because obviously the vast majority of cars overall are still petrol, hybrids, diesels, etc. And battery electric cars are still at around 16% of new car sales, but it is a particular concern when you consider this in the climate perspective, and what this means. These cars are going to be on the road for at least another 15 to 20 years once they're bought. So the kind of long-term and short-term climate impact is quite significant, and it's why the Climate Change Committee have sounded the alarm about the risks that this poses for road transport emissions.
And it's larger vehicle. It goes back to the old rocket science thing. You have a larger vehicle, which means you need a more powerful drivetrain, which means you need a more complex drivetrain, which means it needs more bits, which and the hybrids need more materials, whether it's lithium and it's worth saying, in the last 2 years, it's a very impressive rise in the number of battery electric vehicles, although they are SUVs. Over a doubling in those numbers. Problem being, these are large vehicles, therefore they are using an unnecessary volume of ethically dubious. Go back to the episode with Professor Theo Frankos talking about lithium, how we need to absolutely treat lithium and the associated minerals for battery creation very, very carefully, like absolutely treat them carefully and not dump them into wasteful large vehicles that don't actually have any more capacity than a smaller vehicle. Really problematic.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I mean, and that's something that we're, T&E have been talking about quite a lot in the last couple of years, is that, when, even if you're looking at this from an industrial strategy perspective, smaller is smarter, because you're using fewer resources. One of the, when you think about the level of dependency we've had on other countries when it comes to oil and gas, if we go down a similar route of kind of just chucking loads of resources that are completely unnecessary just to fuel our kind of desire to drive larger and larger cars, we're going to be reliant on other countries to provide those resources to us. We need to be far smarter about how we do it. So, even putting aside the environmental impact of mining those resources and, using those resources, etc., from an industrial geopolitics, political perspective, it's nonsensical. So I think, we need to just see this a far smarter approach when we're talking about this from an EV transition perspective, and ultimately electrifying the car and van fleet, even our truck fleet, is absolutely necessary, and we need to do it, and we absolutely cannot do that in a way that is harming, that's creating wider harms that we don't need to be.
It should be seen as an opportunity. I mean, firstly, it should be seen as an opportunity to foster behavioural change and reduce car reliance, but also it's, as you say, it's an opportunity for us to think differently about the way we obviously there's also, we can think differently about the way that car ownership actually looks, but it makes sense to make vehicles smaller, because requires less, and I know we'll touch on this later, but it requires less additional road capacity because the vehicles are smaller, which makes a huge difference to vehicle flow. In given the pinch points and the bottlenecks are generally urban bottlenecks, having smaller cars means that you get better flow, which means which means that the traffic runs better in towns and cities. There's more space for cyclists. There's more space for better urban realm. You don't have to build as strong. Your bridges aren't all getting smashed to bits by heavier vehicles. Your road surfaces aren't getting smashed to bits. It makes sense for government to step in and assert itself. And occasionally you get feedback. I'm on the soapbox now, and I know we can talk about this later, but I'll do it now anyway. People occasionally say, "Oh, it's not the place of government to regulate what vehicles look like." To which I go, "What? Should we pile up all the regulations about how vehicles are supposed to look, like the height of registration plates, where lights are, wing mirrors? Like, they control so much about how vehicles look. Why can't they control? And they do control vehicle weights. for HGVs, and they're regulating it. Why on earth are we not regulating, just extending the regulation by an additional 10% to say, oh, and by the way, the vehicle size in terms of physical space and also in terms of mass needs to be regulated. You know, you pay more tax if you have a larger vehicle. You have to justify. Yeah. Anyway.
Oh. No, I mean, completely agree. I mean, ultimately, I mean, you know, if we left things up to industry, we probably wouldn't have seatbelts. You know, it's you know, we obviously need government intervention across the board on various issues, and I agree, this is absolutely one of them.
Given that it's government that pays for all the roads, you know, it's just like, yeah.
And I think just, I mean, one additional element to this, I think, you know, why we need smaller and maybe more affordable electric cars, just from an equity perspective. I mean, it at the moment and also I think actually as an element of, from a manufacturer's point of view, and we'll probably come on to kind of why manufacturers are prioritising SUVs, but we've got a situation at the moment where manufacturers are complaining that there isn't enough demand for electric vehicles, but meanwhile they're prioritising selling the really expensive large electric vehicles and not really doing anything. The vast majority of these manufacturers to actually bring more affordable electric vehicles to the market, and that's that you know, ultimately there is obviously a price gap at the moment, but a large part of the price gap is because they're prioritizing larger cars, and they're now in a situation where, you know, a lot of the European manufacturers are worried about what's happening with Chinese car makers coming over to Europe and selling their cars, but ultimately Chinese manufacturers are filling a gap that European manufacturers have been too slow to fill. So you've got this, you know, there is a kind of, I think, an argument for manufacturers to say, actually, this is a big opportunity for them in a way, you know. And I don't want to pitch this as a kind of this is the way the car industry can save themselves type discussion. But it's just
even, you're right though, even on its own measures, the car industry is shooting itself in the foot. Yeah, there is only one estate, you know, one reasonably affordable estate BEV out there right now, and that's the MG5, which is a Chinese manufactured vehicle. That's the only car that I could consider as an electric vehicle that I could get that has the space, that isn't an SUV, that has the range I need. I currently cannot afford it, but that's another story. But the fact is that's, as you say, only one manufacturer. It's a Chinese manufacturer. The incumbents, if you like, have absolutely no interest in filling that market. And in fact, as we might talk about, they're you know, Ford getting rid of the Mondeo, they're actually just getting rid of their smaller vehicle ranges. Although, you know, the Mondeo was not a small vehicle, but it was not an SUV. It didn't have the bloat that the SUVs. Anyway, let's crack on. Conscious that we're already. It always happens. We front load on discussion, and then we hammer through the data. Okay, we've gone from bar charts to pie charts for the data heads out there. Deirdre, Detour, I know you're in the chat somewhere. You will be our resident statistician. So okay, tell us what we're looking at. We've got 6 pie charts here, and they look depressing.
Yeah, so I mean, we've touched on this already, but I think this is basically the share of registrations by powertrain that are SUVs. So, you know, as you can see, overall registrations, as we've talked about, 60% are SUVs. For battery electric cars, that follows the similar sort of trend. Same with diesel. The really interesting ones here is the hybrids and plug-in hybrids, because I mean, hybrids. 2/3 of hybrid sales last year were SUVs, and 3/4 of plug-in hybrid sales were SUVs. So again, you know, it probably shows you where manufacturers are really seeing opportunities here, and we have seen big increases in hybrid sales in last couple of years. Perhaps that's kind of filling a bit of a gap that diesel's been leaving. Obviously, diesel's been in massive decline. But plug-in hybrids compete directly with EVs. They are not competing with other fuel types. They are competing with EVs. So it's really telling that manufacturers are seeing SUVs as a real opportunity in this segment. And you know, as I said earlier, plug-in hybrids are, again, similar to hybrids. They're not a climate solution. You know, just because it's got a small battery in it, it doesn't mean that it's a climate solution. Largely because when you look at the real world testing, people don't tend to drive them on the battery, and that's leading to real world emissions that are the EU's recently published real world emissions, where plug-in hybrids exceed their test emissions by 250%. And so when you consider that these cars are increasingly large by the looks of things in terms of the new car sales, that is a real problem. So not a big fan of plug-in hybrids as well.
Yeah, no, they're very much bad news. And it's just there's a lot of discussion about marketing and about the use of the term. Katie Fenn in the chat talked about the use of the term SUV as a marketing tool, and the fact that it causes problems with people who do need an actual old Defender, and again, this could be fixed if government regulated vehicle sizes appropriately, and anyway, so there's some good discussion about marketing, and marketing is absolutely the problem. It's being harnessed to sell these kind of faux solutions, and what are essentially, again, the funny thing about the hybrids are they're expensive. They're expensive because they've got extra stuff in them, so they're costly. So this, I think, is an emerging theme. The reason we're seeing the rise in SUVs, the reason we're seeing the rise in the hybrid drivetrains is it costs the manufacturers little more to manufacture those vehicles versus a smaller car, but they can sell them for a lot more. We'll come to that later. Anyway, right, we have a different form of graphic now. We're looking at a plot, an XY plot with a line drawn through it, and I sense there's a worrying bit, and it's here.
Yes.
And it's, in fact, it's this bit, potential bit. I'm my addition, by the way, not any statistical thing, to just hint as to what the problem here might be. So tell us what's going on in this graph, Ralph.
So this is from the Climate Change Committee's report that I mentioned a bit earlier, where they talked about this kind of trend towards larger cars effectively offsetting the kind of the CO2 savings that we should be getting from increased engine efficiency. Car makers have been effectively forced over the years to increase the efficiency of their internal combustion engine cars. That's due to regulation that we had in the EU, and obviously since leaving the EU, we've kind of been in an in-between phase. We've now got new regulations that came in from this year, but what we've seen, and the bit that Gareth circled there, is the trend that was happening, where emissions for the average emissions of new internal combustion engine cars were going down. They started to flatline, and then from 2019, they've just been going up. And the reason for that is largely because of SUV sales going up. That the cars that we've seen come onto the market in the internal combustion engine cars that we've seen come onto the market are just getting larger. They're getting less efficient. And that is completely contrary to what we need to be doing. We're in a climate emergency, and we need to start.
It almost feels ridiculous to say it. It feels ridiculous to say it, doesn't it? It's like
like tearing my hair out. Like, what are we doing? It's complete opposite to what we need to be seeing. And I think the frustrating thing is here that, if we're honest, the kind of road transport side of transport emissions as a whole is probably the easiest bit to do. We know the technology is there, and we know that the solutions such as getting more people on public transport, reducing the number of cars and vans on the road, that we know there are ways to do that, and we're just going in the wrong direction, or it's stalling. So it's a very very frustrating period, and this is an extremely worrying sign, and it's why the Climate Change Committee have flagged this as an area of concern, that the manufacturers are not continuing to increase their efficiency of the vehicles, because they're prioritising selling these larger and larger SUVs at the same time. So that is a concerning trend.
Yep. Yeah, very, very worrying disconnect there between what needs to happen and what is happening. Okay, so something quite different now. We're into a vertically split bar chart. Actually, I don't know. Vertical histogram? No. What is the correct? Deirdre, help me out here. What's the correct term for this? Or Ralph?
I think it's stacked column.
Stacked column. Yes, it's a stacked column. You're right. Yeah. Okay. So
I think it is. I might be wrong.
Actually, this is feeding exactly into this is just basically the data backing up the previous graph, right? We're looking at but across European countries.
Yes. So this is looking at the share of new car sales by kind of the kind of level of CO2 emissions that car emits, and I've only included cars over 160 grams of CO2 per kilometre. Now, some people might know that that's quite high. It is high. That is, that's not a kind of a run around city car or even a small SUV, to be honest. I think I looked at it earlier, and even a compact SUV like a Nissan Qashqai is well below 160 grams of CO2 per kilometre. I think that was in the 140s or maybe low 150s. So we are talking about kind of generally larger and very highly polluting cars in this group. And as you can see, the share of registrations for these groups of kind of highly polluting cars is quite high. So, 15% of all new car sales last year were above 160 grams per CO2 per kilometre. And the particularly worrying bit is that kind of darker blue part of for the UK, where over 6% were over 200 grams of CO2 per kilometre, which is absolutely ludicrous. And obviously, comparing it to sort of other European countries, and I think France is probably the most the funniest one to compare it to, because it's chalk and cheese. 0.7% total over 160 grams CO2 per kilometre. It probably reflects a number of things, and we might come on to it. There are different taxation landscapes in both of the countries. There is probably also a different just general automotive landscape. France, French manufacturers, car makers, they, sort of think about Renault, Citroën, they are known for producing smaller cars. Obviously, compare it to Germany, where they're, the home of Audi, Mercedes and BMW, who produce some of the largest cars around. It's probably no surprise that Germany has got a higher proportion, slightly higher proportion of these highly polluting cars than even the UK does. But it does show, with France, what's possible. And as I say, we'll probably come on to kind of how they've managed to achieve that and what might be behind that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we press on. Now we have another line graph. And we're looking at GHG emissions, or rather, we're looking at acquisition tax rate in euros versus GHG emissions. Right, this one, we've now we've gone into. I'm in the deep end. I've no idea what we're looking at. So enlighten me as to what we've currently got on screen. Everything's going up, by the way. Yeah, go on.
As simple as possible. So this is looking at acquisition tax. So when we talk about acquisition tax, that's the tax you'd pay when you buy a brand new car. So in the UK, that's called first year vehicle excise duty. And what we're looking at, and the way that the UK's first year vehicle excise duty system works is it gets higher the higher the CO2 emissions of the car is. So the higher the CO2 emissions of the car, the higher tax you'll pay on it. The other countries on this graph do exactly the same thing. So Tierney did some analysis of basically every bit of car taxation across Europe. Thankfully, I wasn't involved in the actual analysis because that would have been painful. But yes, we have some brilliant colleagues that do the hard work behind this. And so, it's just you're trying to understand how different countries tax vehicles of different CO2 level. So what you can see from this is, the UK does have this CO2-based system, but you'll notice we're quite low down here. Now, just to maybe give a kind of a reference point on this. So an average petrol SUV emits around 160 grams of CO2 per kilometre, I believe. So in the UK, you would pay £255 when you buy that car to tax it in that first year, and then you would pay whatever the annual tax rate is. In France, the same car, you would pay €2,000. So it's about 10 times, well, sort of roughly 10 times more whatever the kind of the exchange rate is. In the Netherlands, for the same car, you'd pay €10,000.
Ooh, that's what I'm talking about.
Quite a significant gap between where the UK is on just an average, petrol SUV compared to where other countries are at. So already you're starting to maybe understand.
Yeah, this explains the issue. Yeah.
Why there is a bit of a gap, or why there is a kind of a bit of an issue where SUVs are really not discouraged in the UK at all. And obviously, and I guess an important caveat here is that the greenhouse gas emissions don't necessarily suggest that we're talking about a larger car, but it generally does indicate a larger car. Obviously, you'll have sports cars that will be at the higher end of the GHG emissions. But we are talking about generally it's SUVs that are getting off pretty scot-free when it comes to taxation. Quite a good example, and I think it's on the next slide. And we took an example of a BMW X5.
Yeah.
So that is again, we're looking at a car that emits 196 grams of CO2 per kilometre. So this is kind of edging its way towards being in that really high polluting group that we talked about a couple of slides ago. Again, in the UK, you would pay €1,800 to tax that in its first year. Comparing that to the Netherlands, where you would pay €32,000, and then in France, you would pay €60,000. Now, when we published this data, we did a release on all this data around taxation. People just wouldn't believe us that France taxed these cars that highly. But when you go back to the slide a couple of slides ago, where you see the amount of cars, this one, the amount of cars over the kind of even 160 grams of CO2 per kilometre that France has on the roads, it's extremely low, and that is partly the reason they've effectively been taxed out of existence, because the French tax system, it makes no sense to buy one of those cars. So it's
they did the good thing, which is tax the bad car off the road. It's possible, folks. It can be done.
Yeah, it's. I mean, obviously, again, there are other factors, and it's not to say that there aren't SUVs on the roads in France. And obviously, we've seen there's been debate about there's been talk about SUV parking charges in Paris and
I was going to say there are lots of SUVs parked in Paris. They're owned by Parisians, but if you drive into Paris, you'll get charged a lot to park your SUV.
Yeah. So it's a bit. It goes to show that I think one thing goes to show is that obviously the UK's sort of car tax system when it comes to new car purchases is pretty weak. To say the least. But it also goes to show that there are examples that they could follow. I mean, it doesn't even need to be that the UK follows the French example of taxing a new car €60,000. But even if it went up to even where Croatia is, it would probably make a pretty big difference to actually just discouraging, to starting to kind of make people think a little bit more about buying these cars, to add an extra 8-9 grand to the purchase price. That could be quite a significant difference. But obviously, at the moment, the €1,800 euros is pretty insignificant when you consider the cost of these cars generally.
Absolutely, yeah, it's trivial. So this then allows us to jump up to looking at. So we're now looking at. We're back to the first graph, except just looking at battery SUVs. So tell us the story here, Ralph.
Yeah, so I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I think what we're seeing with battery electric SUVs is following the kind of wider trend. To be honest, I think it's we've seen, I think it's about 133% rise from 2021 to 2023. So, and obviously, battery electric car sales on the whole, sort of in terms of total volumes, are going up quite considerably. But as you can see here, and I think what maybe kind of is a little bit different to what we've seen in the overall market, where in the overall market it was compact SUVs that dominated, whereas in the battery electric market, it's medium-sized SUVs that are the kind of dominant one, which are that bit bigger.
I was going to say
size.
The word medium is a bit of a euphemism because that category says medium, but those vehicles are enormous. The mediums are huge vehicles. The D class SUVs are all enormous. They're like the big Audis and the big BMWs. I mean, I know there are bigger vehicles, but they're the really big ones. They're the estate car SUVs that are in that category. It's
Yeah, exactly. It's sizable vehicles. I mean, I think the example that was given in the when sort of thinking about this from kind of the overall market perspective in that category. I mean, I think it was sort of Land Rover Defender kind of comes into this category, so it gives you an idea of the sort of size that we're talking about when we're talking about a medium SUV. So yeah, the wording of it is the issue, and obviously. That's kind of talks to the point around the kind of definitions of SUV not being necessarily that useful, but it does go to show that when we're talking about SUVs in the EV market, we are seeing manufacturers really prioritise some quite large ones as well. Probably talks to the type of overall cars that are coming onto the market in the EV market. I talked a bit earlier about manufacturers are really kind of failing to prioritise bringing more affordable models to the market in the EV segment, probably more than any other segment or any other powertrain. I mean, and this probably goes to show that they're really prioritising those kind of higher end models, which is not good from an environmental perspective, a resource use perspective, but also a kind of an equity perspective, etc. So really, concerning.
Absolutely. It's the other challenge is that, well, not a challenge. Another factor here is that the fact that an electric vehicle greatly reduces the long-term take of vehicle manufacturers because they are that much more reliable. They have that many fewer moving parts. It means that not just for the manufacturer, but also for the kind of the car sales, the middlemen who sell you the cars. They need to be selling cars that have a higher markup so that they can offset that long-term lost income for the fact that EVs don't require as much fuss over their lifetime, in theory. So you can understand if in an open and unregulated market why vehicle sizes are increasing. I mean, electric vehicle sizes are increasing. It's offsetting that problem, as it were. It's front-loading the cash. So.
I think this was sort of covered in this, but as I said, the share that SUVs make up of battery electric sales has really gone up in recent years. I mean, even back in 2021, it was the EV market was still dominated by other types of vehicles, but in recent years there's been a real change, and that's mainly due to just the changing maturity of the EV market. Where perhaps in 2021 it was still quite a lot of Nissan Leafs and Renault Zoes that sort of dominated the market.
Good electric cars, the kind that we want.
More sensible type of cars, but we've now obviously seen the EV market develop quite considerably in terms of the types of cars coming onto the market, and that's, I think, reflected in this that in the EV market, it's sort of reflecting on what's happening in the overall market for SUVs and other vehicle segments as well.
It's absolutely breathtaking that in 1 year it flipped.
Yeah.
In 1 year, from 2021 to 2022, it flipped from SUVs being around 40%. In fact, it exactly the figures flipped. It was 57% everything else, 43% SUVs in 2021, and those numbers exactly flipped over the course of a year. I suppose that will have been exaggerated by the uptake, by the increased uptake in vehicle sales post COVID again, where you had possibly so there was an acceleration in the market. That market change could accelerate kind of perhaps unnaturally quickly as the uptake increased. But it just seems
potentially could be. I mean ultimately this is looking at the share of registration. So we obviously would have seen the actual total registrations go up. That definitely would have happened. And obviously we know that EV sales are going up overall anyway. Even if the actual overall market share has stalled a little bit in the last 12 months, but I think it's just down to the kind of the EV market becoming a lot more mature in terms of we're seeing a lot more models just on the market.
So I think the proliferation of models is reflecting the proliferation at large.
Yeah, the post-COVID bounce was probably, manufacturers that had kind of planned models to come out, and they maybe just delayed them until to come out in 2022. Part of it also may have been this is a complete guess, and I actually don't know, but some of it may have been that some of the European manufacturers are delaying EV sales to comply with EU CO2 regulations potentially. So it may have been sort of compliance angle of it as well potentially, but I'm not too sure.
Yeah, crikey. Cheerful stuff. Grief. Right, so last two graphics now, I think, is what is, it's all very well, occasionally I have people come back to me and say, oh, there's no difference in size really between an SUV and, an estate car. They use up the same space. They're built on the same, they're built on the same platform, which is in quite a few cases true. But that sort of doesn't do justice to the changes that we're seeing across the car market, and this is being driven by SUV sales. And this graph is one of the ones that makes that point, or this graphic is one of the ones that makes that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm hoping that at some point we'll have exactly the same graphic, but for car weight as well, because I think that'd also be interesting to look at as well. But this is looking at car width, and people might look at the kind of the writing in bold there and think 1 centimetre wider every 2 years. That doesn't sound like much. But as it says in the line below, this has been happening since 2001. So when you add that up, it's quite considerable. So, basically what we're getting to now is that the average car in Europe now exceeds 180 centimetres in terms of width. Now, that's quite an important sort of threshold, because an on-street, the minimum specification for an on-street parking space in terms of width is 180 centimetres. So we're now at a point where the average car is filling up the entire space with no room for doors or anything like that, as you can see in the graphic.
I was going to say, put this graphic up now, yeah.
So, it's, and even if you're looking at this for, to kind of, like a multi-story car park where your parking bays are maybe 240 centimetres wide, which is the kind of standard, I think. Even then, it doesn't actually leave you much space to get out of your car. So even when you think about this from a parking perspective, it's a nightmare. If you think about this from the perspective of cyclists, and that's sort of one of the points we wanted to make with this graphic. I mean, I don't live in London anymore, but I've seen streets like this. I lived in southwest London in Putney. I've seen terrace streets exactly like this, where you've got SUVs parked both sides, cyclists happily going about their day, and someone trying to overtake them. Now, if you're in a situation where the cars are just getting wider and wider, cyclists are marginalised in this situation massively. Another important point, and I wanted to raise this because I think it's quite interesting that this never gets raised with SUVs, but it always gets raised with low traffic neighbourhoods, is that if you're getting into a situation where passenger vehicles are getting wider and wider, it's going to impede the movement of other more important vehicles that are moving around our roads. So ambulances, fire trucks, even buses, taxi services, etc. It always gets raised with low traffic neighbourhoods. Ambulances can't get through them, even though they can. But it never gets talked about with SUVs. So, cars are taking up more and more room, and it's to the detriment of everybody else. The important point to make here is that we do have width regulations in place, but they were brought in the mid-1990s to regulate the width of buses and trucks, because they were getting wider. So regulation was brought in so that these vehicles can't get wider than 255 centimetres. But that is it. So cars technically can get as wide as that. There's nothing stopping manufacturers from bringing out a car that is 255 centimetres wide, because there's nothing in the regulations. There's been no update. There's been no consideration of this trend towards larger SUVs,
which is baffling, isn't it? Absolutely shocking.
Yeah. So there is a kind of a compelling case now to review those regulations. So these regulations were made at EU level. The UK has got these regulations within its own. It adopted it from after Brexit. So the UK and the EU can act on it. They can very easily. It wouldn't require primary legislation or anything like that. It would just be amending existing regulations to include something that covers passenger cars, where they could actually say cars cannot be wider than this amount. And take your pick as to what width you want it to be. But that is something that could be easily done and would prevent this kind of or help to prevent this trend from continuing at the rates that it is continuing at the moment. So I think there's a really compelling case for intervention on car width, and ultimately the reason why width is particularly important from a potentially tackling SUVs is obviously to get the height you need the width. So the width is quite an important part of the car. When you're trying to create a higher ride height and making it higher,
making sure that you really do eat those pedestrians when you ride the pavement. Yeah, absolutely.
So it's tackling width is actually could be quite a really good way of trying to tackle the rise of SUVs in a way that obviously it would just target manufacturers, so it wouldn't have any impact on consumers at all. It just puts that requirement on car makers to start producing more sensibly sized cars. So I think that's it is a very compelling case to intervene there.
Absolutely, and there's so many secondary effects. I've already touched on the fact that, and as you said, actually, mass it'd be very interesting to explore mass. So the previous graph that we had, it'd be very interesting to explore mass in relation to that. But with mass, we've talked about the fact that you get more potholes in the road, that bridges are getting knackered more quickly, road surfaces, and so on. With width, you have increasing incidence of pavement parking. So you're reducing the space, not just for cyclists, but also for pedestrians, people with buggies, wheelchairs. This is incredibly hostile design. Of course, the other thing with these vehicle size, not necessarily width, the height of the bonnet and other things, is the safety. The safety element of this is that as cars are getting larger, they are and you can pick up the statistics. The level of harm for vulnerable road users, be them pedestrians, cyclists, is increasing ride height. We're having these tragic situations where that defender ended up just crashing into a school ground and killing children. It just absolutely these are hostile vehicles. They are hostile to human life. They are hostile to our way of living, and they should be regulated and taxed out of existence. It's really frightening.
Yeah, I think on the safety side of things, it's the really significant bit of it of an SUV that is the big crux of the problem. Besides the weight, obviously the weight is a big part of it, because obviously the heavier the car, if that's hitting, if a heavy car is hitting you at 30 miles an hour, that's not obviously going to be anywhere near. It's going to be far more significant than a kind of a far lighter car hitting you. So obviously the weight is a big part of it, but I think in terms of the impact on injuries and fatalities, it's the height and the shape of the front bumper or grille that really makes a big impact. And so there's studies in the US that have shown that large SUVs are twice as likely to cause a pedestrian fatality than a standard sized saloon car, and about eight times more likely to cause fatality in a collision with a child. So it's really, these are quite stark statistics, and there's been similar studies in Belgium that have shown similar things. I think the blind spot thing is a really big thing, because one of the arguments that people have for SUVs and as a positive for SUVs is that you've got better visibility of the road, but it's complete nonsense. You get better visibility of the road right, far away in the distance. But right directly in front of your car, you can't see anything because the bumper's too long and it's too high.
Easy graphics showing you the line of sight being constrained by the bonnet compared versus other vehicles. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think just to pick up on another couple of studies that I think were really, really interesting, and kind of, I think probably validated what I sometimes think about SUV drivers sometimes, and I think what other people do think about them. And you kind of talked about them being hostile vehicles. So there's research in Vienna that showed that people driving in SUVs tend to actually break the law more often. And
Yeah.
there's another study, I think it was in Canada, where they did some simulation of people driving a vehicle at a higher height. And it basically showed that people tend to drive faster and with more variability. And I think there's this element, it gives people a full sense of security in the vehicle, that they know if they're involved in the collision, they're probably fine.
Yeah.
There's a kind of a, they don't necessarily need to be too worried about themselves and their own safety. But obviously for everybody else around them, these are incredibly dangerous vehicles. And I don't think it gets talked about enough when we talk about road safety issues. We talk a lot about speed and traffic calming measures and all these sorts of things. But actually, I think the size of the vehicles is the big elephant in the room when we're talking about car safety and road safety that we really do need to be tackling. And I think the marketing of these vehicles doesn't help either. When you look at the way that they're advertised on TV, they're kind of advertised quite aggressively. The way that the way they come across on TV, it's quite intimidating, and it's deliberate. They're making them feel like these kind of very individual and powerful vehicles for people to buy and make them appealing in that way. And that's, for me, what's quite terrifying, is that's kind of very deliberate on the manufacturer's point of view, that they want them to come across that way. It's the sort of fake engine noise in the background or something like that, and it's I guess the advert that sticks in my mind as really insidious is the one for the F, what is it, the F plus type, whatever it's advertised, some kind of producer or DJ guy, sorry, a nobody, kind of like stroking a DJ deck and then stroking a steering wheel, and then driving, and you hear the loud revving in the background, but it all feels very smooth. And the classic thing of completely empty roads, like always these car adverts have completely empty roads. But there's something else I want to talk about, which we touched on just before the episode picked up when we were sat in our virtual green room, is financing. And I just wanted you to briefly talk. I'm conscious we've slightly gone over time, but not too badly. I just wanted you to talk a little bit about financing and the way that people have been, because it's the combination, it's the ultimate capitalist consumerist sort of dichotomy of, or not dichotomy, a destination and trajectory of finance and automotive industry collaborating to trap people into debt, but also result in higher consumerism. Yeah, and I'm going to kind of put in the disclaimer here that this is not Tierney research that I'm going to be citing here. I'll give I don't know him, but it's a political economist called Tom Duran who's done a lot of fantastic work on this.
He's been a guest on the show, actually, talking with his book about British Railways. So yeah,
Tom. Brilliant. Friend of the show already. But he's done some fantastic work on this issue around how car financing is enabling people to buy more expensive cars. I guess just to maybe give the context. So the vast majority of new car purchases are made using finance options. So people don't, particularly new cars, they don't buy them with, they're certainly not buying them cash in hand. It's financing is what is enabling people to buy new cars a lot of the time. That's in the private market. Obviously, a lot of the market is also fleets as well. Now, with car financing, what we used to have and what used to dominate the market was hire purchase agreements, which would be where you would basically pay the entire value of the car over a period of a lease, and at the end of that lease, you would own the car. So that was the model that we had that was in place. That kind of that did dominate the way that finance models worked. What's happened in more recent years is the development of something called personal contract purchases, sort of also known as PCPs. And what that means practically is that consumers tend to pay around half of the value of the car in repayments, and then they get the option at the end of the lease to buy the car. So rather than paying the full amount, they're only paying half, and then they get the option to buy it. People never buy it. They will always then swap it back for a new car and just start all over again. So what that's meaning, because they're only paying half the value of the car, it means they can afford a far more expensive car because they're only paying half the value off in the same period of time. And that, this is what Tom Haynes-Doran picks up on in his research, is that is effectively fueling the purchases of more expensive cars. He didn't go as far as saying it was fueling necessarily the rise in SUVs, but I think you could probably make that assumption that there is clearly a link between expensive cars and SUVs, and we know SUV sales are going through the roof. So this is a really significant development that is kind of, I talked a little bit about the fact that SUVs are not really being taxed properly, but the fact that people are being enabled to buy more expensive or lease more expensive cars and then swap them back and then get another one in 3 years' time is a really, really concerning development. Yeah. And as you said, and it's again something that's picked up in his research, is that this was done basically in collaboration between the car industry and the finance industry, and it's a massive win for the car industry because it means they can just continue selling more and more cars, and they can market more expensive cars in the new market. So it's of no real surprise that SUV sales are up at 60% in the UK when these sorts of models exist. So yeah, really, really concerning. Particularly when you consider the massive desire that manufacturers have. You mentioned, I think, quite early on in the show, the massive desire they have to sell SUVs because it costs them the same amount to make them, but they can just put a markup on them. So the markup on an SUV is around is between 8 and 30%, according to a sort of analysis that we've done. That the markup that they can put on SUVs compared to non-SUVs. So it's from their perspective, this is brilliant. That they can continue to push these cars. So really, really.
They're the only people that it's brilliant for. Like the automotive industry, the fossil fuel industry, and the finance industry are the ones benefiting from larger cars. Nobody else is benefiting. Like absolutely nobody else. It's a pretty scary situation. So, how do you wrap up? Well, I'll tell you how you wrap up by telling everyone what the ideal car is, unless you've got kids. If it's you and a partner, I can tell you from experience, this is the ideal car. It's a smart 451, so not the newest one, but the previous generation. Pick it up secondhand, put in an EV conversion kit, and you're cooking on gas because these things are brilliant. And also, if you get hit by an HGV, which I was in our one, it bounces out of the way, keeping you safe. So that's the ideal car. No, the serious note here is that we have effective small cars. This is not an unsolved technology. They're around. There are plenty. We've seen Europe has some quite interesting, weird, innovative little electric things that are designed not to count as cars, but they can drive them around as cars. What's the one that's doors open in weird reverse, so they only have to manufacture one type? What's it called? Is it a Renault thing or is it a Citroen thing? It's a ridiculous little thing, and I saw it in Italy when I was over there a year or two ago, and it's brilliant.
I think.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's a clever little idea. Stuff like that is the future. Like, if in terms of people moving around, in terms of mobility, that for those people who are not traveling for people who want to do the shopping in that rather than on the bus, then that's a great solution. For those who can't use public transport or can't walk or cycle, then there are there should be vehicle options out there. That vehicle is not legal in the UK. I don't believe it's legal in the UK for various reasons. Whereas all of the SUVs we've just talked about are. I think that's upside down. People are saying Renault Twizy. Other people are saying the Ami. Lots of the Citroen Ami and the Renault Twizy. Also, the names are brilliant. Rather than the Dominator and the Emasculator and the whatever the SUV names are. Anyway. Oh right, Ralph. We should draw the episode. In fact, I tell you what. And what is your closing remarks on other than the questions we might have popping up? We've had lots of comments, not a huge number of questions, lots and lots of comments. Some really good chat. Apart from the weird conspiracy theorist guy who I've banned, lots of really interesting chat going on. I'm very pleased about that. Ralph, in terms of concluding that, what are your thoughts? Is your big message everyone should be campaigning for government to step in and think about regulation and think about higher acquisition taxes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that one thing I would say is I think it's very easy, and I think people do sort of pin this on the people who are buying the cars. Ultimately, there's nothing stopping the people from buying these cars because there's no regulation, no tax that's actually trying to push them in the other direction. At the end of the day, manufacturers are prioritising these vehicles because they can make tons of profit on them. They're a cash cow for the car industry, and government has done absolutely nothing to try and stem that. So absolutely, people should be campaigning for government to introduce, not only introduce taxation, because obviously that's one thing, but I actually think just regulating the car industry. There are ways that they can do that. They could set, when you're looking at this from an EV perspective, they could set minimum efficiency requirements on electric vehicles, which would help to downsize those cars. They could set width limits, which we talked about. So there are other ways where it's wider than just taxation. They can actually target the car industry, who are ultimately the cause of this issue, and the ones that need to be regulated to fix the issue as well. So I think that's kind of the big takeaway for me.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you so much. So before we come to our kind of closing remarks and kind of summing things up, the usual plugs. So firstly, thanks to everyone who listened to this in audio-only format. This was a highly graphical episode, but hopefully we've done a reasonable job of audio describing what was on screen. Thanks for all of those of you who stick with the audio-only form. Always a pleasure. I don't think Google Podcasts exists anymore, so I need to get rid of it. There are other podcasting platforms available. The usual other plugs, patreon.com/Gareth Dennis for supporting more of this happening, and getting some. Once the book is out, there'll be or submitted. Second draft is about to be submitted. I'll be doing more stuff on Patreon itself because I've neglected you lovely Patreon folk for too long. It's time to do some fun Patreon stuff. So there'll be some fun Patreon stuff, not to mention all the potential book-based Patreon action as well. GarethDennis.co.uk/merch for the merchandise. You can go and buy things. We need to update. We need suggestions for new merch, always welcome. Stuff you want to put on a t-shirt. PayPal.me/Gareth Dennis for loose change and abuse. And the chat, which has been in fine form tonight, and questions are starting to pour in. Do send questions. GarethDennis.co.uk/Discord for the Discord server where all the delights continue unabated. Ralph, a chance for you to talk about Transport Environment, because it's Transport Environment, the NGO who's supported you to do all this fantastic work, and your team working on this stuff, really good stuff. Yeah, tell us about TNE.
Yeah, so I mean, as I say, we're a Brussels-based charity. We're an I've got a lot of colleagues in Brussels, but we've got a small UK team. We're doing a lot of work around SEVs, as you can tell. We're also doing some wider work around equity with regards to EVs, industrial strategy, charging infrastructure, taxation. But then we're also doing excellent work for my colleagues that are doing excellent work on aviation and shipping. So do check us out for more of the kind of graphs that you've seen throughout this episode, and more. But yeah, please do get in touch.
Absolutely, and I'm looking forward to sharing more of the information as it comes out. Keen to, and indeed, if there's more fun stuff, Ralph, it'd be great to have you on to share it. Next week, episode 212, if I make it back from Milton Keynes in time, we're going to be doing a classic page turn. We're going to be looking at TfW's plans for fixing buses in Wales, which should be fun, because buses in Wales are a particularly unique shambles. That should be a fun one. It's a classic nice page turn, which should be good fun. The last thing I want to plug before we go back to Ralph, answer a few questions, because a few questions have pinged in. I just want to say that I just want to shout out the episode of Trash Future that just came out is absolutely sensational. The Devon Report, featuring the whole cast and crew of Kill James Bond podcast. Brilliant episode. If you want to understand everything that's wrong with the cast review, just go and listen to that episode. It's wonderful. I burst into tears at the end because of when you get to the 1 hour 10 minute mark, 10-second mark, you'll understand why. Yes, go listen to that Trash Feature. It's joyous. It's wonderful. Please do, and share it far and wide, and generally make loud noise about how awful the cash review is. So, On which note, we must go back to answer some questions on a few questions have come through. So I just want to very quickly answer this question. I've taken a quarter of an hour more of your time than I promised I would. I'm so sorry, Ralph. Thank you so much for sticking with us. So let's go backwards. We have got Hannah Goodliff. Hello, Hannah. Lovely to see you in the chat. I'm here. Oh my God. Some Skype has attacked. I'm getting Skype spam bots attacking me, which doesn't happen very often. It's happening with more regularity. Hannah asks, what are the next steps for the average consumer in their own use and decisions on cars? It's an interesting question. Ralph.
Oh, that's
I know. Don't buy big cars.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously, as I said earlier, I think I'm always very reluctant to kind of blame consumers in this, because
people have their reasons. People have their reasons, and the choices really, as we've talked about, are kind of being made for them. If there are no estates available, then no EV estates available other than the MG5. People are being pushed into a different. I've got friends who couldn't get an estate because Skoda didn't make an estate that fitted their car seat in it, because they've got rid of the larger one and they've just replaced it with an SUV. So they ended up with an SUV. They've now got rid of it again. But these things happen to people who don't want to be picking SUVs. It's not that everyone who's driving an SUV is a prick.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I guess what I'd say is, obviously, look, there are smaller, more affordable EVs coming to the market. That is happening. So certainly, I think this year there are a lot of new models coming to the market, and certainly next year there are a lot in the pipeline. So one that off the top of my head is the Renault 5 is coming back in all electric form. So there are more models coming to the market. I mean, in terms of what it can do for your own decisions, own use. I mean, it's what works for you ultimately, and ultimately it's not. Obviously, we should want everybody to be buying. If you need a car, to be buying an EV. If you don't necessarily need a car, then join a car club if there's one near you, or speak to your local authorities and in your area to see whether there are car club can be brought to your area. Certainly, if you live in London, there are plenty of options. Unfortunately, I think there's a bit of an insurance crisis with car clubs at the moment.
Literally in the chat, they said right now, there's been an insurance crisis on it for some reason. Yeah.
But it's a difficult one to answer, because it's down to people to make those decisions. But obviously, as I think I said earlier, smaller is smarter. I said that from an industrial strategy perspective, but I'd like to sort of say that from a kind of a general perspective. Smaller is smarter, and obviously if it can be electric, then even better. EVs that are coming onto the market nowadays are good quality cars. Charging infrastructure is getting better. If you can charge from home, you're going to save quite a lot of money. If you need a car, then it's and you could afford to get one, then it's a no-brainer at the moment.
Absolutely. There you are. That's all there is really. I mean, a nice way to, I think, ending on, it's a big Rail Natter theme, which is that consumer choice is manufactured, and that we should not be punishing individuals for the choices they have to make. We have to incentivize and reward people from being able to and provide them the opportunity to make the right choices. So it's a really nice way to end. Ralph, thank you so much. That's just been really, really, just like the best of Rail Natter is where we just really sink our teeth into the numbers. Really, really interesting episode. An absolute joy to have you on. Keep in touch. We look forward to having you on to tell us more about the data and anything else that, any other research that you think is particularly interesting. Do reach out and we'll be keen to have you on again. It only remains for me to say to everyone in the chat, so that everyone can go to bed and I can get back onto my Word document and start writing. Don't laugh, those of you who want me to use latex. Is to say cheerio, everyone. Cheerio, cheerio. Cheerio.